Casper Kuile is helping to build a world of joyful belonging. In the midst of enormous changes in how we experience community and spirituality, Casper connects people and co-creates projects that help us live lives of greater connection, meaning, and depth. I know this, I've seen it. Nothing makes Casper happier than learning from religious tradition and reimagining it for our contexts. He holds Masters of Divinity and Public Policy degrees from Harvard, and he remains a Ministry Innovation Fellow at the Harvard Divinity School. And he co-hosts an award-winning podcast named Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Anybody know it? There are 65,000 followers. And he's the co-founder of activist training program Campaign Boot Camp. His book, The Power of Ritual, Harper is publishing in the summer of 2020. He lives in Brooklyn, New York with his husband, Sean Lair. Angie Thurston is the co-founder of Sacred Design Lab and a ministry fellow at Harvard Divinity School, moved as she is by the plight of isolation and despair around us. She's dedicated to connecting the inner life of spirit to the outer life of action for social change. Angie is the co-creator of the Formation Project, a startup designed for spiritual deepening among people who don't live in the same place or share a set of religious beliefs. She's a graduate of Brown University and the Harvard Divinity School, and she lives in Alexandria, Virginia, with her husband, Vipin Thek. I got that right?
Yep.
Awesome. They have become dear friends of mine and represent something that I hope will spread like wildfire, which is a conversation between those of us who profess the Christian faith in the great tradition and people who are looking for deep meaning. My language would be they're looking for God and to see what we can learn from one another. So, Angie, Casper, would you come?
Thank you, Jack. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Bishop Lee. Thank you to all of you for welcoming us here to Chicago. It's such a pleasure to be back, exactly as you were saying. Who was here for last year's keynote with Ray Suarez? Who of you remember that? There was a lot of information about the data, about how there's trends in religious affiliation and disaffiliation. And so if you can, and if you were here last year, imagine that this is kind of part 2 of that story. But before we dig into what we hope will be stimulating and perhaps a little provocative as well as inspiring, we want to just give you a little bit of a sense of who we are and why we care about this. Because we are 2 unaffiliated millennials. You might have heard of this species out in the wild. I hope it's not too much of a zoo experience,
Right.
but we want to give you a little bit of sense of who we are.
So I'm Angie. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And by way of my spiritual autobiography, I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, the child of 2 prototypical spiritual seekers, my mother from a Jewish home and background, and my father from a Methodist upbringing in Ohio. And the 2 of them had both had kind of social and political forms of religious life, but they had these spiritual hearts that weren't being filled. And so they moved their way to San Francisco and found this text called the Urantia book, which almost no one has heard of, but which has 2,000 pages. One person has heard of.
Wow.
Oh my goodness. Okay, who's heard of the Urantia book? This is actually statistically significant.
Yeah.
All right. Highly unusual and very exciting for me. So I grew up with this book as the kind of spiritual center of my home life. And it's a 2,000-page textbook on the universe, all about God and Jesus, but there's no organized religion around it. So I've been unaffiliated my whole life, but I've also been certainly nurtured to be deeply spiritual my whole life, and I have indeed turned out to be so. And this has been a motivating factor for me all the way through my high school and college years. I ended up pursuing the arts for a good part of my 20s. I studied playwriting undergrad and moved to Brooklyn, New York, where I put on plays and musicals for a good 6 years. And in that time, I started to notice how much meaning I got and my peers seemed to get out of this experience of coming together and co-creating something bigger than ourselves. It almost felt like we were touching something transcendent. but our conversations never talked about that. We would come together, we would make something, we would kind of experience the high of that, and then we would disband again. And I really became more and more hungry and more interested in what it was that was going on when we came together, when we gathered, and what it was that we were actually trying to point toward with our idealism, right, in our 20s in New York making art. And it was just chance that I happened to meet a roommate of mine happened to go to Harvard Divinity School to study religious relics. And I was like, what is divinity school? And she told me a little bit about it. And little by little, I started to notice at the same time that there was something fascinating happening amongst my peers when it came to religious identity. When I was online dating in 2009, I learned the phrase the phrase spiritual but not religious on Match.com, and I wondered suddenly what it was and where all the people who had that label were going. And that was really what prompted, as embarrassing as it sounds, an inquiry into what became a whole bunch of new knowledge about this changing religious landscape and the fact that a third of my generation at that time was unaffiliated, but that so many of us were searching spiritually. So that was part of the path that led me to divinity school, which is when I met Casper.
And as you can probably hear, I grew up in England, so I already feel like there's some connection between us. For good and bad, perhaps. But so I grew up in the UK, which of course has a much more secular orientation than the United States. I grew up in a village where we didn't go to church. I didn't know anyone who went to church. The word God was never spoken, and as someone who came out in their teenage years, my perception of religion was that either it was irrelevant or cruel. Those were the two options. I became a climate activist, so I was very involved in mobilizing young people around climate change issues. And like so many young activists, had that experience of, at some point, burning out. Feeling like I had nothing left to give, and that the scale of the challenge so outweighed my capacity to make change. And so I started to read more in the history books of how social movements have endured, how leaders were resilient, and this spiritual religious thing kept coming up, which I was very unsure about. But I followed my curiosity, and like Angie, ended up in the divinity school, where both of us were asking this question: where do people like us, unaffiliated, younger people, find meaning and community? So we'll tell you a little bit more about what we found in just a moment. But before we do that, let's reorient ourselves. Our little stories fit into a much, much bigger picture. Now, you will have seen the data, so this is not new information. This is not something to make you feel bad. This is just to remind us where we are. This is a graph that looks at the percentage rate of disaffiliation of people who are outside of religious institutions per age bracket. So you'll see that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be outside of a religious institution. The latest Pew data that came out just a few weeks ago concluded that 40% of people in our age bracket, of the millennials, 40% are now unaffiliated. And although we don't have conclusive data yet on Gen Z, which is the next generation who are now 18, 20, and younger, that number looks likely to rise to 50%. So what we're in the middle of is a sort of epochal change in how we are understanding who we are, our religious identity, and how we practice meaning-making and are in relationship. I want to say something very clearly right now, just in case you're feeling that shame drain, that this has nothing to do with how good or bad you are at your job. This is a much bigger trend about disconnection from institutions, whether they're religious, whether they're political, whether they're media. And so this is a much bigger picture than any individual congregation's success or failure. Does that make sense? Okay? So hold on to that. Hold on to that, because this can be tough to look at. Because what these numbers show is that there's a growing chasm between individuals and their experience and the institutions which have been created to serve them. So the rate of closures of churches will not be a surprise to you. Just be grateful you're not the Methodist Church, is what I like to say, with our loving friends in the Methodist world. But most often there are, denominations who are unable to keep up with the rate of closures that they have to support. In the Jewish world, it looks a little different. There, it's much more about the continuation of identity. For those of you familiar with the Jewish institutional world, the big question was for many years about intermarriage, right? That when someone who's Jewish marries someone who's not Jewish, the result is usually non-Jewish grandchildren. And so there was a lot of anxiety about that. We see seminaries merging, shrinking, closing down. And again, this is all part of this much bigger wave of shifting sands in the landscape of institutions. Just think about the Rotary Club or the Elks, right? This rise of the internet age is building new things, and other things are left in its wake. Now, all of that stress on institutions leaves us with a cultural crisis too.
Right, and I think it's worth saying just up front that our position on this is that the needs that have led to religion all along still exist, and if anything, they are more acute given some of the existential challenges we now face, right? So presuming that people are still in this space of hungering for meaning, hungering for connection, so many of them now are finding themselves unmoored from tradition or from a stable sense of religious identity in the midst of that. So 2 in 3 of those who are unaffiliated also say they believe in God. 1 in 5 of those pray every day, right? And these statistics continue to evolve as even our ways of asking the questions change to try to understand what's going on in the spiritual lives of these unaffiliated millennials and just people in the US in general. But this is, again, as Casper was saying with the bigger trends, this is part of a larger story of isolation and loneliness. So among Americans, just in general, we have 1 in 4 saying they have nobody to talk to about what really matters to them. And 1 in 5 say they have only one confidant that they can really rely on. So it's truly a crisis of isolation that people are feeling in their lives, and that is even having an impact on health outcomes. It's now statistically been shown that loneliness may reduce life expectancy more than obesity or smoking. So in a meta-analysis of over 70 studies, they studied 3 million people and found that it was a greater risk than obesity or smoking 15 cigarettes a day to be isolated. And so we're really, now we're in a place where the entire healthcare industry is coming to terms with the fact that so many of the deaths that are coming to them are connected to this isolation, and they're at a loss for how to address that.
I really want to stress that this crisis of isolation is no longer something to just be kind of sad about. This is a major public health threat. The former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy talked about emotional well-being and social disconnection as the #1 issue that drove multiple health impacts. So for example, it takes on average about 4 people to tell you to go to the doctor to get that thing checked out. And if we don't have 4 people telling us to do that, we're statistically less likely to go to the doctor sooner, meaning that we're less likely to discover a breast cancer diagnosis, for example. So these drivers are systemic in nature. And as Angie was saying, the health world isn't really set up to meet these needs, right? This isn't something that you can dispense a drug for. Or even the growing trend of social prescribing, where if someone comes to you and you think, gosh, this person actually probably needs more community, often the levers that doctors can pull is to say, hey, go to this art museum or join this club with all the other lonely people who I've prescribed you to join, which, as you will know, as community leaders, you need a healthy carrying capacity to welcome in folks who right now maybe just need a little more love and support. So we're seeing, again, this kind of mismatch between what people are needing and the systems that are there to serve them. But all of this is just the groundwork to remember where we are. What we want to talk about are some of the stories that have inspired us, where people are building community in surprising and perhaps religious ways. And when we went out to do our research to understand where people were finding community, one kept coming up over and over again, and that was CrossFit. Do we have any CrossFitters in the room? Has anyone ever tried? Yes, I see some hands at the back. Yes, some people have tried it out. Well done, brave people. So CrossFit is not just a gym where you walk in and there's a running machine and there's a rowing machine, and you kind of have your headphones on and you ignore everyone else. No. CrossFit is a all-in experience of shared struggle and joy.
Suffering is key.
Suffering is key. Literally, they describe themselves as, our culture is made of suffering and laughter. So what happens is you join a CrossFit class. It starts at a specific time. And every day, there is a workout of the day that happens. So in each of the 15,000 CrossFit affiliates around the world, the same set of exercises are done by each class. So a mix of, medicine ball throws and burpees and 500-meter sprints. And so there's this sense of connection across space and time with all the other people doing the same physical movements that you're doing. Perhaps just a little bit like saying the Lord's Prayer. But more than anything else, the thing that strikes you about CrossFit is how evangelical they are, right? How do you know if someone went to Harvard, is vegan, or does CrossFit? They tell you. That's right.
Nailed it.
Right? It's built into the culture, but even the structure of how this organization operates. If you want to open a new gym, you need to do two things. Number one, go to a 2-day seminar. And number two, compare that to 3 years of divinity school, by the way, and all of the different steps that you need to take to become ordained. And number two, you have to write a letter. And in the letter, they're not looking for your business experience or your skills as a trainer. No, they're looking for, has your life been changed by CrossFit? And do you want to change other people's lives with CrossFit? They are so evangelical that this is not just an exercise routine, this is a life-saving technology for CrossFit. They are taking the fight against big sugar, the big soda industry. They're funding new scientific studies to counter the studies funded by Pepsi, for example. And as this kind of intense culture builds, you see all sorts of interesting things happen. So for example, that workout of the day often has a name. And some of them are named after soldiers, policemen and women, people who've died in the line of service. And Greg Glassman, who's one of the co-founders, says, he came to the divinity school and we interviewed him, and he said, people describe us as a cult, and I say, yeah, we are a cult. I'm not trying to build a skyscraper, I'm trying to shepherd a flock. I'm trying to tend an orchard. And so this pastoral language is in fact very appropriate because people come to their fitness trainer to ask them to officiate a wedding. We've heard of funerals happening in CrossFit boxes. People get together after work for drinks. There's mums and babies workout groups. There's bring your pet day. There is one CrossFit that we went to had a talent show where people did stand-up comedy for the first time, or they played the cello for the first time in 20 years. These are meaning-making communities that people turn to in times of need. So if you're going away maybe to visit your mom and someone needs to take out the dog, these are the people that you might call. If you need a ride to the hospital, these are the folks that you draw on. And so as you try and kind of imagine yourself into these spaces, think of them as doing the same things that congregations might do, at least some of them.
And I should say, I was one of the biggest CrossFit skeptics when Casper and I started doing this work together. We've had a very participant observation approach to our work, which means we've tried and participated in a lot of the things we've described here, including CrossFit. And I was definitely wary of the very bro-y culture that it has a reputation for. But one of the things that's really touched my heart is to see how many nonprofit CrossFit boxes there are. They call the gyms boxes. And that are dedicated to things like addiction recovery or fitness for returning veterans or fitness for young people who are at risk. They'll take groups of kids throughout the whole age range of adolescence into teenage life when they're at greatest risk for starting drug habits and things like this. And it's been so transformative in so many people's lives to connect these things. And so I got to be at the CrossFit Games, which is where the faithful gather, with a group of these CrossFit nonprofit box leaders and ask them, who here has had an experience of another CrossFitter showing up for you or a loved one in a time of need? And every single hand went up. And I just had to say, when faced with the statistics that Casper and I just showed about the isolation and whatnot that's so rampant, it's a dramatically different culture that's happening inside of these spaces, and one that feels important. So speaking of culture change, this is a group called the Dinner Party. The Dinner Party is a group that was started by some 20 and 30-somethings who had all experienced significant loss, which is to say the loss of a parent or a sibling or a partner, someone very dear to them at a young age, right? And Lennon Flowers, who's one of the co-founders, talks eloquently about how, it's difficult enough in the 2 weeks following a loss like that. But when you get a year or two down the line and somebody asks, oh, are you going to your mom's for Thanksgiving? And you say, oh, well, actually my mom passed away. Every time, in her words, it's a conversation killer, right? There's just such discomfort with grief and loss in our culture that it as well becomes very isolating. And so Lennon and Carla and a couple of others at one point just said, you know what, let's get together, we're having dinner, we're breaking bread, we'll get some wine, and we're gonna have a conversation where death is on the table. And lo and behold, they were there for hours and hours and hours, and they said, we have to do this again. And then they started to, as they continued to do it, word started to get out. The Dinner Party has now spread globally. They've been in Oprah magazine, they've been on podcasts, they've basically gotten to a point where they cannot meet the demand for people to find tables to be together. And so what is that coming from? Well, I think a big factor is spiritual accompaniment, right? It's people being around a table together where they're able to share vulnerably about what matters most to them and to be held in that space and to experience it as worthy of their sharing, right? That they can express what's true there and it's really held, and then they can make space for others to do the same. And it's that very environment that becomes so healing. Of course, over time, they're not just talking about grief and loss and the anger and the isolation all the time, right? They're talking about all kinds of things, all of the ins and outs of their lives, and they're laughing together and they're forming deep, deep friendships. So it really becomes that catalyst for healing that then, enables them to show up in the rest of their lives in a different way over time. So this is not, the science of the small group will not come as a surprise to you that this is something that works, right? But we couldn't help but also notice that there was something rather Eucharistic about this coming together over bread and wine in remembrance. So the Dinner Party is another example, and we share a few of these rather different examples to highlight that, yes, there are a bunch of these communities that rally around fitness. This is a community rallying around something wholly different, right? But there are some important themes that we'll start to notice being shared across them.
And each of these is ostensibly secular, but with that kind of religious something happening. And I want to stress, none of these communities are perfect. This is not the model that we want everyone to take on. There's all sorts of ethical questions. CrossFit is a for-profit corporation that is expensive. The Dinner Party is really struggling to find a financial model that works and employs, 1.5 people who are manually matching everyone who's written from Kalamazoo with the one person in Kalamazoo who's willing to host strangers in their home to get together over dinner. So each of these are more like signals of what's happening in our culture than they are the perfect model. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me tell you one more story. Afro-Flow Yoga was set up by Leslie Salmon Jones and Jeff Jones. Jeff is a fabulous musician, and they collaborated to create this sort of mix of movement, dance, healing, and community building. It started in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and has really grown from there. They host a lot of retreats and learning experiences. They've hosted ancestral pilgrimages, and these kind of time out of time experiences are another trend that we've seen more and more of. As people are living lives of, as one famous person said, who now I can't remember, quiet desperation. What's that quote from? somewhere. We'll come to it later.
Definitely.
But as we're living lives of the hurry and the stress and just the continuous influx of information and responsibility, these kind of experiences of time out of time continue to be extremely important. So in Afro-Flow Yoga, it's essentially a sort of liturgical arc that happens over an hour-and-a-half session where you follow the two leaders through music and movement to recreate the middle passage. So this is often a healing journey led by Black Americans and Canadians to sort of reclaim and transform the journey of their ancestors. So there's not only the physical movement that happens, but then also the meaning-making conversations that happen afterwards. What did you experience? What did you hear? What showed up for you? A place of non-judgment and welcome, an embodied practice. And not only that, but also an experience of formation for the leaders who then take it to a future community. So again, things that you might happen to think of as religious showing up in a space that on the first kind of reason why someone might show up was as much to do with their physical fitness as it was to do with their spiritual life. So all of these are just part of a much wider landscape of all sorts of communities doing these kind of things. There's been an explosion in adult summer camps. Have you heard of these springing up everywhere? A chance to have a very different way of being together for a short period of time where you're not allowed to talk about work, where you come up with a different name and you're only known as that name, where you have a chance to be creative and silly for the first time in forever. Things like Daybreaker, the morning non-alcohol induced rave that goes from 6 a.m. till 8:30 a.m. before someone goes to their workday, to have that sense of transcendent connection through music and dance.
We love Thread in Baltimore, which is basically using love as a strategy for at-risk students who are basically accompanied throughout the entire experience of high school by 8 volunteers whose job is to love them. And so being wrapped up in love throughout this entire experience, you can bet not only is it successful in terms of completion rates for high school, it is also transformative not only in the lives of the students, but in the lives of the volunteers, right, who get that opportunity to develop relationship and to be of service in such a deep way. And they've had extraordinary success. I mean, they talk about their work as the new social fabric, but they're taking it very seriously with love at the center.
I'll tell you one more story just about SoulCycle. Have we had any people who've tried SoulCycle in the room? Yes. If I can ask you to do, well, there's many things I'd like to ask you, but one of them would be just go and visit some of these communities. Try and experience what happens. If you go to a SoulCycle class, you will realize very quickly that this, again, is a liturgical journey, 45 minutes on a stationary bike. And ostensibly, it's a workout, right? You're there to get a hot body, you're there to feel good, but oh no, it's much more. The founders of SoulCycle say people come for the workout, but they stay for the breakthrough. Because what happens on the bike, you're in near pitch darkness, there are little candle votives at the front of the room where there's a sort of altar-like raised platform on which the instructor rides. And they don't tell you, dial up the resistance and cycle harder or cycle slower. No. They're saying things like, who are you riding for today? What do you want to let go of? I mean, classic kind of meaning-making questions. And you're sitting there.
There is a miracle waiting for you on this bicycle. Clap so the angels can hear you.
It's total preaching.
It's real.
Absolute preaching. We went to one class in West Hollywood where exactly this happened. And we asked the woman who was leading the session, tell us about, what influences your guidance as you're leading people through this exercise routine. And she said, well, I went to Oral Roberts undergrad. I was like, well, I could have told you by that theology that was hidden, and so it's just so interesting to keep seeing these religious things show up in these secular places. The most astounding of which with SoulCycle is this. Each class costs like $28 for a 45-minute session. It's expensive. And booking opens at 12 p.m. on a Monday so that you can book your seats for the classes that you want to take. But if you live in the Hamptons or in New York City where this service is offered, for $10,000 additional every year, you can get to book your seat on the Sunday so that you can do what? Sit in the front row. Paying for pews still exists. It's just happening at SoulCycle. So there's just these eternal human things that keep showing up, and now they're showing up at SoulCycle. So all of that is to say, there's this landscape of organizations that may not yet be familiar to you, but through our lens, they are doing the same kind of things and with the same kind of problems that we might see in congregational life. And for us, there were 6 themes that kept showing up in how these organizations talked about themselves, in their manifestos, in their websites, in the interviews that we did, and in the way in which their members and participants talked about what it meant to them. The first of which was social transformation, the sense that being part of this community helps me make a change in the world. Now that might be through volunteering or through justice work, but it might also be through creating beauty. One community called Group Muse matches classical musicians with people that have a living room that can host guests to create these moments of effervescence and beauty in domestic spaces. The second theme was personal transformation, the sense that this as a community would help me to become the person that I want to be in the world. That, again, that might be just through getting myself into shape, but it also might be an ethical interest. Again, CrossFit talks about the way you show up in the gym is the way you show up in life. That the way we treat one another here is an exercise in formation of how we're going to be in the world outside. Perhaps my favorite theme is accountability. Now, we in the church world have a very uncomfortable relationship with that word, right? There's such a history of exclusion and marginalization that we feel very tender about anything of drawing a boundary. At least that's been my experience. And yet, Springtide Research, which is a new research firm that just set up, that went out and asked, I think at this point, tens of thousands of young people, which of these 6 themes they most wanted in their life, the number 1 answer was accountability. Because in a world where we have so much, the flaky millennial trend, right? We have to text 3 times before they show up to a thing, right? In a world where commitment means so little, for someone to hold you accountable to a goal that you've set for yourself is an expression of care. That this meant that they believed in me to be able to do the thing I had said that I wanted to do. So accountability shows up time and time again in lots of these communities.
Creativity has been really beautiful to see. So certainly that's in the morning dance parties and those adult summer camps, but it's also in things like maker spaces. There's a great one called Artisans Asylum that we got to know in Somerville, where they have makers giving right around this time of year, where everybody shows up not only with a potluck dish, but also with something that they created, whether it's a 3D printed vase or a robot that's gonna pass the salt. There's a kind of wacky, but also deeply personal sense of community that's formed around people's creative self-expression, and that's something that's popping up more and more. We just were visiting libraries the other day. The library I went to in Arlington has just installed a whole new maker space inside the library for people to be able to weld and craft and sew. Purpose finding, this one is huge. One of our kind of casual metrics for these communities and how deep they are is whether by participating, people end up leaving their jobs. And why do they leave their jobs? It's because through their participation in these communities, they discover something deep about themselves, about their vocation perhaps, even a sense of call, and they discover that the life they've been living and the job they've been doing on a daily basis is not actually aligned with who they really are, and that they end up making different choices and basically being catalyzed by their participation and feeling supported in that as well, and discovering both their gifts and how they might share them. And then undergirding all of that is this sense of community. And Casper and I have become protective of the word community because amidst a crisis of isolation, people are very hungry for it. And so you've probably seen this word community kind of broadcast by a lot of brands because they know that it's a thing people crave. So similarly to the concept of greenwashing in the environmental movement, where all of a sudden all the products are labeled as green, but it doesn't mean anything anymore. We think there's a bit of community washing going on. And the reality of community, as we don't have to tell you, is not a surface level pretty thing. It is the deep and messy reality of, as our mentor Kuile likes to say, being deeply known and deeply loved, right? And getting to both give and receive that experience. And that's actually knowing and showing up for the highs and lows and everything in between. And that is rare. And that's what we see in a lot of these spaces.
So we want to invite you into a moment of empathy. We'd like you to think of someone in your life, a young person perhaps, someone who is outside of your church communities, but who you know well enough that if you called them, they would pick up the phone. It might be a niece or a nephew or a neighbor, kid of a friend, it might be a friend of yours. I want you to picture that person as much as you can. Just take a minute, let that person come to your mind. And if you've got them in your head, just raise your hand so we can get a sense of where we are. Great, wonderful. So you can say hello to that person in your mind. Hello, welcome. And what I want you to do is just to imagine they're not in a church or in a religious context. Where might they be finding some of these things in their life? Is it in their online gaming group or through streaming Fortnite with friends? Is it on the sports field somewhere? Is it in a hobbying club? Where might be some of these 6 themes showing up in their life? So I'd like to talk to you. I'd like you to talk to someone next to you about where you think that might be showing up for them. We'll just take a couple minutes and then we'll come back. Does that make sense? All right. Thank you.
I think so.
Okay. Let's find out. Oh, yeah. Great. I'm sorry. I didn't remember that.
But we can put the themes back. So
Yeah.
they can.
Great. Okay. I'm sorry.
No.
I was like, I don't think we have that on there. There you go. Yeah.
Well, what do you recognize and what surprised you? I mean, they could discuss that too.
Well, we could ask for some people to share what came up for their table.
Yes. Oh, at these.
Yeah, there's some microphones. There's 1, 4, 2. There's little numbers on them. Interesting. Sorry.
No. I mean, this is great. Yeah, we could do.
Because we finish at 4:10? 4 or 5. 4 or 5. Yeah, probably not then.
Let's see. It says discuss, and then maybe we could say we're framing this for discussion, but then talk about it.
Great.
Great.
Can you do that? Do you know how to do that?
Because right after that, it goes into the
come alongside. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can also invite them to just reflect personally. No. They're happily talking. We'll give them another minute or 2.
Mm-hmm.
So wait, what are you going to do?
So we'll talk about these people and
Yeah.
how great they are.
Yeah.
And then we'll say that, well, we can just skip that slide.
Yeah. I'm wondering if I should go over there and just ask them to delete the slide.
Sure, you could try. It's unclear whether... I don't know if he deleted the right one.
I think you did.
Okay.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, welcome back. So one of the things that I hope came up for you, just bringing to mind a real human being that you know and care about, is that so often when we're thinking about innovation or change within the church landscape, the people that we're talking about become this kind of gray blobs of, distance and unfamiliarity, when really we just need to remember that we already know and love these people, right? This is not a foreign land that we have to travel to. These are people that we already know and love. And we have come to know and love exactly these people who've led these communities. For the last, nearly 5 years now, we've been bringing together the leaders who created these kind of communities, who nearly always had an experience, went looking for something that would help them with that, didn't quite find it, and then ended up setting up the thing that they needed themselves. The dinner party is a great example. Lennon and Carla both lost a parent, felt like they didn't want to go to a kind of a support group which made them feel like their experience was medicalized or something. They wanted a space that was beautiful and life-giving, and so they just created it around their own kitchen table. And one of the great joys in our work has been to bring together leaders of these kind of communities that are ostensibly secular with leaders who are doing innovative things within the religious world. So perhaps a Jewish eco-farm, or a Muslim small group, or an Episcopalian food truck, as Sean Steele, who is here in this photograph, is doing down in Texas. And for us, this was a bit of a risky move. We were like, okay, we're bringing these secular people together, we're bringing these religious people together. Is this gonna work? Within 2 or 3 hours, you couldn't tell who was who, because there was something that was underneath the individual expressions, whether it was a CrossFit box or a text study group. There was something that both of those communities that they were doing that was deeper and richer than their coating on the outside.
Yeah, and not only that, just as an anecdote, it's been really interesting to learn that a lot of the community leaders who are leading nominally secular communities are themselves people who grew up going to the Jewish summer camp. They're pastors' kids. They're actually often people who have been very exposed to religious life of a certain kind, and so they have that experience template to then bring to bear on the digital detox or on the CrossFit, right? So that's just been a really fascinating and surprising interplay for us to discover too, that yes, indeed, they are not far afield, a lot of the innovators who are bringing these things into being.
And for a lot of those leaders, they feel completely alone.
Yeah.
They feel like this is the first time that anyone is doing this, that, oh God, what do you do when there's a sexual assault in your community? What happens when you suddenly grow and you have 30 different local groups and they want different things? How do I officiate a wedding? How do I accompany someone through a cancer diagnosis? So they've ended up needing the very things that religious institutions know all about, right? Even questions of polity are useful to these leaders. So all of this is interesting, but what does it mean for you here in the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago? We want to invite you to think of one particular, really an attitude or an approach that you might hold on to as you think about this growing landscape that's here and all around the country. We want you to come alongside these communities, and particularly to come alongside the leaders of these communities. We wouldn't be here if we didn't know that they needed you. Mm-hmm. Because if you're doing something and you feel like you're making it up as you go along, if you're realizing that you can only lead your community as far as you've gone yourself, you're hungry for mentors and elders, for people who have resolved difficult conflicts in a community before, who can talk to you about what this God thing might be, who can sit with you when you're struggling and everything feels like it's falling apart, and who know how delightful and joyous it is when it's all coming together. So we'll share just 2 little stories about some of the ways in which we've seen that coming alongside starting to happen.
Yeah, and as we go into these stories, I just want to underscore the extent to which these community leaders are being treated as pastors, and without having been trained for it, and without having meant to do it, right, as Casper was saying, and also just how moving it's been to see the sincerity of their hearts and their genuine desire to be able to meet the life needs of the people in their care. Simultaneously, they feel woefully unequipped to do that, and it's to their credit. You know, and I'm generalizing, of course, but as we've gotten to know so many of these leaders, it's to their credit that they know that this is beyond the pale of what they're familiar with, right? But that's part of why we've then taken it upon ourselves to some extent, and why we're issuing this invitation to imagine, well, what could it look like to come alongside these leaders with wisdom and love? So this is an example called Nuns and Nuns, that some of you may be familiar with. So that's nuns as in Catholic sisters, and nuns, N-O-N-E-S, as in unaffiliated millennials. And both names are slightly inaccurate because these sisters are not cloistered, and the millennials tend to be more spiritually diverse than unaffiliated. But the reality is that they've been coming together around the country for at least 3 years now for conversations and relationship building in this moment of so many questions about religious change and about where the Spirit is moving now. And what's been so just beautiful to see and to be part of has been the discovery of alignment and kinship amongst these folks. And I think, you know, for both of us, the concept of charism was totally new. And for these millennials that we've been working with in this project, the same holds true for them. But that's been one of the really amazing things, is to see these sisters begin to share some of what their charism is. And they come from different orders, you know, so these different charisms and the different gifts of the Holy Spirit that they are trying to live out in practice. And then to see this recognition from the millennials of like, oh, well, yeah, radical hospitality, that's exactly what I do. Or like being among the poor and the marginalized, like that's my jam. You know, this kind of like amazing in terms of the social transformation we talked about, but also deeply in terms of the personal formation. There was one beautiful moment where one of the millennials, in a moment of kind of some frustration about the state of the world, said, all I want to do is transform myself in the context of community to serve the world. And the sister turned to him and said, my friend, that is what we call religious life. Right? So this like amazing discovery of kinship. And then it's like, what do we do about this? So that's just beginning to happen. There are a group of these millennials who went and spent 6 months at the Mercy Center in California, living in residency with the sisters. And here's where that thing I was saying about community really comes to bear, because so many of us in our generation are so bereft of deep community that we can romanticize it a little bit, of like, oh, if only we weren't so lonely, then we would have this amazing. And of course, the reality of these millennials living in situ with these sisters was like, who didn't take out the trash last night because it's smelling up the hall, and you had way too many people over, and oh, you know, now the sisters need to use the chapel again, right? And we were gonna have, so it's just been really, really sweet and very cool to see what's happening as these relationships go from conversation to things like cohabitation, right? And also to big and deep questions about, in many of these orders, the sisters are aging, and they're prepared for, you know, certainly the end of what they've known in these environments. Sisters are caring for each other as they're aging, and in many cases all the way through until death. And so there's a poignancy about this whole thing where these millennials are asking, and the sisters are asking too, if we have something shared here, what does that mean? And where is the Spirit moving now?
I want to underscore one really important thing. Those sisters did not welcome those millennials into their life wanting them to become nuns, right? It's very easy once we see this alignment to think, oh, all we've got to do is just bring them back into the congregation. Like, let them come in, see how great what we have is, and everything will be fine. That is not going to happen. More and more people like me don't have anything to go back to because we didn't grow up with it in the first place. So it's really important to stress that this meeting of minds and hearts and spirits is not one that's predicated on a bait and switch of we're going to become friends and then you're going to join the congregation. Okay? I know it's tempting. This was a genuine collaboration of seeing like, hey, I'm gonna enter this conversation with an open heart to see where it goes, and it might go nowhere. And the same came from the other side. So I really want to stress that because it's the attitude that you have into the relationship which is immediately able to be picked up. So it's about coming alongside, not about like come into our building. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. The other story that we want to tell happened in this fair city just 2 weeks ago. You'll recognize the master chef right in the back row there. This was a gathering, this was called the Liturgy Lab. This was a gathering, as Bishop Lee was saying, of liturgists and scholars of liturgy from within the Episcopal Church with folks who were experienced designers out in the secular world. So we had, for example, Kurshat Ozenk, who leads the Stanford Ritual Design Lab, where he works with students and with private clients to help them create meaning-making rituals, either of their everyday life or within their company culture. We had Maceo Paisley, who's a choreographer and runs a community in LA called Citizens of Culture, where he creates these amazing installations and experiences using different forms of art and especially dance. We had Matthew Chavez, who is known as the subway therapist. He sits in the subway in New York City and kind of dresses up in a suit and has a little sign that says, you know, doctor's offices are open, and lots of sticky notes and pens. And he puts up a question, and folks will just take a sticky note and write an answer and put it up on the subway wall, so that by the end of the day, you have hundreds and sometimes thousands of answers, which become this sort of living, breathing confessional, really. You had Ida Benedetto, who's an extremely fantastic experienced designer who works with, Google and all the, wildly amazing big companies out there, but also has done some fascinating research looking at patterns of transformation. What are places and experiences that people are having that changes them? And she looked at 3 things: wilderness journeys out in the wild, funerals, and sex parties. And she also did participant research, which was very brave. But Ida said that the number one thing that makes an experience transformative, and this was a kind of aha moment for the liturgist in the room, was the amount of risk that it asked of the participants. So, in a wilderness context, it's about physical danger, right? In a sex party context, it's about rejection and intimacy. In a funeral, it's about our emotional transgressions, right? Not wanting to break decorum. So each of these experience designers were coming in with real expertise in their field, but a sense, in their words, that they're making it up as they go along, right? That Ida's research was at the forefront of something. And then on the other side of the room, you have these liturgists who are saying, well, that's really interesting because the processional liturgies of early Rome had very similar themes as what you're talking about. And so we had this incredible meeting of minds where people realized, my goodness, we use different language to describe what we do, but what we're doing actually has real resonance with one another. And there's a wonderful kind of creative meeting of minds in that. But for us, most importantly, it was for these younger people to realize that actually they're in a long line of tradition. And for them to feel a connection that what they're doing is perhaps even holy work. And to feel that these are mentors in waiting, people to collaborate with. We had the senior liturgist from the Cathedral of St. John the Divine with us, Patrick, who was in a small group with Ida, and we gave them some design challenges to work with. We met around Halloween. So we were working especially around rituals of living and death, and how people can be in remembrance or be connected and remember the people who have died, who they loved. And Ida and Pat just had this immediate connection and have ended up designing something that I hope will come to fruition of a beautiful public grieving ceremony for women who've experienced miscarriage. So there's the kind of new sparks of creativity that come up in these coming alongside collaborations, where whole new possibilities emerge which none of us could have come up with on our own. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And importantly, I think, as you were saying, with the residency that emerged from Nuns and Nuns, something like that public ritual, which Patrick, of course, proposed St. John the Divine, because that's a place that he has access to. But the people that would be served by a ritual like that would be the people of New York City, regardless of their association with the church, right? So that kind of, again, the quality of collaboration and coming alongside that is absolutely connected to the living wisdom, and in some cases even things like physical spaces, but that is also serving people in different ways and who have had different experiences. So that's kind of that's the landscape that we dwell in and the invitation that we're here to offer. And one of the sisters we've gotten to know is Carol Zinn, who's the director of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and she says something we've found moving, which is that ours was a radical response to the gospel in our time and place, and now that time and place is changing, and the Spirit is moving, and how beautiful would it be if we were there to meet it? And that's been her rallying cry, to be part of this kind of work. And another sister, do you remember which sister it was who quoted?
I think it was Mary.
Was it Mary?
Yeah.
At our first gathering of nuns and nuns, she said, I have been praying on this passage in Isaiah for 20 years. Mm-hmm. This passage about God's new thing. And she looked around the room at these young people who were doing such deep work with such sincerity, and she said, now I know I've found it. And something that I just, again, as a sort of testimony, she wasn't speaking to us directly, but to these other innovators, but we've had the privilege of being in ever deeper relationship with elders because of this work, and spiritual elders. It is so meaningful to have someone of that kind of spiritual maturity and poise say to you that what you're doing is holy work. It is a transformative experience, and then from that place to actually deepen relationship and to potentially even collaborate, right? But there's something about that recognition that says, oh, I see a new thing that God is doing in the world. I see a new thing that you are doing, and I see that it is, that there are blessings coming from it. That has been such a moving experience for us as unaffiliated millennials, and we've seen it again and again in the people that we're trying to serve.
So as you gather this weekend here in this lovely hotel ballroom, we wanted to leave you just with this provocation that God does not belong to the church, not even the Episcopal Church. Sorry, guys. It's so easy for us, with all the structures of relationship and responsibility that we have built around us to support the work that we're doing here together, to keep our eyes focused on one another and the work at hand. But we want to invite you to think about the neighborhoods in which you're in, the communities that are there, perhaps that you don't even know about. Mm-hmm. I would love you to go on a neighborhood walk with your congregation to see how many of these kind of communities you can spot. Some of them will be formal with websites and manifestos. Some of them will not. They'll just be associations of neighbors or people who get together regularly. And to wonder, what would it look like for us to come alongside these kind of communities? Where might we find the holy in the world outside our doors? And then you have the best thing going for you, Episcopalians. You know how to bless people. You've got all of that holy oil, right? I'm not even kidding. I co-host this podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where we read the Harry Potter novels as if they're sacred texts. We do Lectio Divina, and we do Jewish reading practices, and kind of Ignatian spiritual imagination with these books. And of course, this was nothing new to the hundreds of thousands of people who already read the Harry Potter books as if they're sacred texts, right? They reread them every year. They turn to them in times of trial. They have tattoos of Dumbledore's words. And if you ask anyone, which house are you in, they're going to tell you, I'm a Gryffindor, I'm a Ravenclaw, right? Like, these are meaning-making structures that are in our world. So all we were doing was saying, what you're doing is legitimate. that you're turning to this text as a place of solace and inspiration. We can help you do it better by translating these ancient reading practices that came from, Guido II, a Carthusian monk from the 13th century. That's relevant for you because it will help you to love the text better and to live your life in the way that you want to. So at the gathering we did in Orlando, we did a sort of pilgrimage towards the Orlando Harry Potter world. Different conversation, but one of the, and ethical questions. But one of the things that we did there was that we blessed the characters in the books, so, which we do on the podcast every week. I bless Hermione for her diligence and her hard work and her faithfulness as being a friend. But then we took it a next step, and we said, I'm going to say this to you, Jody, but I'm going to pretend that you're Hermione. So Hermione, you're so faithful, you're so diligent. And of course, Jody is sitting there feeling that blessing coming onto her and being like, oh, wow, this feels amazing. And then the next step was to say, what's a blessing that you want in your life? What is something that you would like to be blessed for? Maybe something that's hard, something that's beautiful. And then we gave them the choice. You can just stay with words. You can use consensual touch. Or you can use oil. And there was not a dry eye in that room when people felt that they had permission to bless one another. And this is something that you have in spades. So please go out and bless these good people in your communities, in your neighborhoods, because in our eyes, they are doing holy work, and they need you. They need you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. So, just before we finish, and Jeff comes back on stage, just another moment to turn to your tables, the folks who you've been talking to hopefully for a little bit longer than just today, and share something from this conversation that has resonated for you, something that it perhaps doesn't resonate, that feels challenging, and then to think about what questions might you ask now, not necessarily to us today, but in your community and in your congregation. And we'll bring you back in just about 5 minutes or so and hear from Jeff as we close. Thanks, everyone. Friends, I know that's just the beginning, but luckily you have a few more days together. So we'll just pass it on to Bishop Lee.
Church, are you still with us? I thank you for engaging in this. I don't know about you, but this is one of the most interesting conversations I've been part of for a long, long time. And I want to reiterate two things. One thing that Angie said, quoting Sister somebody. Can't remember who said this, but you will know instantly. To be deeply known and deeply loved. What could be more central to the faith of Christians than that proclamation? That God, in fact, knows us better than we know ourselves and loves us more than we could imagine. If there is a universal longing at the heart, and I believe there is, of what it is to be human, is it Augustine who has said, inside every human person there's a God-shaped hole. Indeed. It's that desire, that longing, that insatiable thirst to be deeply known and deeply loved. And the second thing is to add my amen to the simple and theologically sound observation that God does not belong to the church. If God did, God would not be God. But I believe the church is a place of reliable encounter with the mystery of God, and it is not up to me to tell God how else to reveal God's being in this world. What I think is up to me is to tell the good news of what I've heard and what I've experienced. And that's the opportunity I had, a profound and blessed opportunity just a couple of weeks ago with a group of people who are deeply hungry for God, my words, whether they would use that or not. It looked familiar to me. And to have the experience of celebrating evening prayer in the cathedral for All Saints' Day, and throwing handfuls of incense on hot coals and singing the Psalms and calling out the names of those we love who have died in that space. And afterward, to have a young woman who's an experienced designer, Reiki practitioner, outside any kind of obvious Christian faith community, she came to me with wide eyes and she said, "They came." I said, "Who came?" And she said, "The people I was remembering, they came. They were there." Well, now, we talk about the evangelical power of the liturgy, friends. Oh. We have some wonderful work to do. And I also want to reiterate that this cannot be a trick for getting people to join their churches. There's a difference. I say this all the time. There is a huge and an important difference between evangelization and church growth. Evangelism simply means sharing the good news we've heard with open hearts and open hands. Church growth, there are tons of books on techniques for doing that. It is not that hard. We might look very different, but go ask any practitioner at any megachurch and they will tell you exactly how to do it. But evangelism means sharing the God you and I have come to know. So here's my charge. Church, I want us to get curious. I want us to get out of church and find out, as Casper said, who's out there and what are they doing in this business of creating meaning-making communities, of nurturing the spiritual life. And then once we've found them, I want us to have an honest conversation. I want us to do some blessing, but I also want to have an honest, heartfelt, open-handed, open-hearted conversation about things that matter most to us. I want us to be able to talk about our relationship with God in Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit in a way that is not trying to coerce somebody into seeing it my way, but to share it because I have found life. And then I want to hear how you are finding life. Can we do that? There's not a town, there's not a suburb, there's not a place in the city of Chicago where these movements are not springing up. Let's go find them and enter into real relationship. I think God's calling us to that. tell the truth at every baptism and at every renewal of baptismal vows. You know the promise. Will you seek and serve Christ in every one? Everyone. Everyone. And when you find him in everyone, love him there. Thanks. Angie, Casper, thank you for being with us.